Get up. That seat isn't yours anymore.
You gave my seat to your mistress? You really thought he'd choose you? This isn't over. What was that?
No, this can't be happening.
Welcome to Silent Queen's Reckoning. I am so glad you could join us today. Now, let's dive right into the story. Chapter 1. The whole stadium was chanting when Adrian Cross told his wife to stand up and surrender her VIP seat to his mistress. Claire Whitmore did not move at first. She sat beneath the blazing white lights of the World Cup final. One hand rested on the small velvet box in her lap, the other curled tightly around the edge of the leather seat she had chosen months ago. Below them, the field shone bright green under the intense floodlights. Cameras swept over 90,000 roaring fans, while flags rippled like waves of fire across every tier. Adrian leaned in close enough for the scent of his expensive cologne to cut through the humid air of rain, grass, and champagne. "Claire," he said through a practiced, razor-thin smile, "do not embarrass me. Stand up." On his other side, Bianca Vale tilted her head with artificial sweetness. She was 26, blonde, glossy, and dressed in a white designer suit that looked far more appropriate for a yacht party than a football-sized stadium. Around her neck hung the sapphire pendant Claire had noticed missing from Adrian's home, safe 2 weeks earlier. Bianca held 2 crystal flutes as if she had already been welcomed into Claire's life and was merely waiting for the wife to accept the seating arrangement. "I told him I did not mind sitting behind," Bianca said, her voice soft enough to sound innocent yet loud enough for the row to hear. "But Adrian said I should have the better view tonight." Claire looked down at the seat number on her ticket. Royal Box XA12. Her name was printed clearly beneath it. Claire A. Whitmore, not Mrs. Cross, not guest of Adrian Cross, and certainly not a +1. Her name. Adrian's fingers tightened painfully around her shoulder. He was still smiling because the cameras were nearby. He had built his entire empire by never appearing cruel when anyone important might be watching. "This is a networking night," he murmured, his voice a low hiss. "Bianca needs to meet people. You hate football anyway." Claire turned her face toward him slowly. She had not raised her voice once in 12 years of marriage, and Adrian had clearly mistaken that silence for a lack of volume in her soul. "I watched qualifiers with my father before you even knew what a penalty was," she said. Her tone, as his smile twitched. "Do not be dramatic." Bianca laughed lightly, a hollow sound. "It is just a seat," she added. Claire looked at her directly. "Then take another one." For the first time. Bianca's eyes sharpened with genuine malice. Adrian's hand slid from Claire's shoulder to her upper arm. It was not a grab exactly. Not enough for a scandal if photographed, but enough to tell her he believed her body could still be moved by his will. "You will stand," he commanded. The velvet box in Claire's lap suddenly felt heavier. Inside was the small gold pin her father had worn to every match he attended before he passed. She had brought it because tonight the stadium would announce a youth football foundation funded in his name. Adrian did not know that. He did not know because he had not read the official invitation. He had not asked why Claire's ticket arrived separately, nor had he questioned why the head of tournament hospitality personally called to confirm her dietary needs. He had only seen a royal box and assumed his own business connections had finally placed him where he deserved to be. That had always been Adrian's favorite assumption. If a door opened near him, he believed it had opened for him. "Adrian," Claire said, "remove your hand." His eyes narrowed as he glanced around. Executives, athletes, and federation guests pretended not to listen while recording every word. The national anthem was moments away, and a camera crane floated above the neighboring section, hunting for faces to broadcast. Bianca stepped closer, her lips forming a little pout of annoyance. "Claire, please, you are making this very uncomfortable for everyone." Claire almost smiled. For years, discomfort had been her assigned territory. She was expected to hold it quietly so Adrian could move through rooms unburdened by his own choices. Tonight, she decided to return that burden to him. She stood, and Adrian's expression eased into one of instant satisfaction. Then, Claire picked up the small event tablet attached to the seat, tapped the concierge icon, and spoke into the live service line. "This is Claire Whitmore in Royal Box A12. Please send the head of security and the tournament's hospitality director immediately. There is an unauthorized guest attempting to occupy my assigned sponsor seat. Adrian froze mid-breath. Bianca's fake smile vanished entirely. The anthem began, and 90,000 people rose in unison. Claire remained standing with everyone else, calm beneath the deafening roar while her husband finally looked at the ticket in her hand. Only then did he see the gold crest beside her name, Founding Patron. Chapter 2. Adrian Cross had always liked public events because they made his private cruelty efficient. In a private room, Claire might ask difficult questions she might refuse. She might make him explain why Bianca needed to travel with them, why Bianca had a suite in the same hotel, or why Bianca's name appeared on a VIP list Adrian claimed his assistant had arranged by mistake. But in public, Adrian expected Claire to protect his image, even while he actively damaged her dignity. That had been their tacit marital arrangement long before he brought another woman into their lives. The anthem filled the stadium, a booming patriotic tide. Claire sang softly, holding her head high. Adrian did not. His gaze flicked from her ticket to the aisle, then toward the encroaching cameras. Bianca stood with a hand over her heart, but her mouth did not know the words to the song. The sapphire pendant at her throat caught the light each time she swallowed nervously. When the anthem ended, the stadium exploded again into chaos. Adrian leaned close. "Cancel whatever you just did," he hissed. Claire looked down at the field. "No, Adrian, the match is starting. Do you understand who is here tonight?" "Yes," she said. "I approved most of the guest list." He stared at her, stunned. The first whistle blew. Below them, the players surged forward with predatory speed. The sound of the crowd rolled over the royal box like incoming weather. For one surreal minute, Adrian said absolutely nothing. The ball moved beautifully from midfield to the right wing, and Claire watched it with the focused, quiet sorrow of a woman aware that one long chapter of her life was ending in the middle of the world's loudest celebration. Then, two men in sharp, dark suits appeared in the aisle. The first was Thomas Reed, the tournament hospitality director, a man with silver hair and a reputation for being unflappable. Claire had known him since her father sponsored the youth league that gave Thomas his first job. The second was a security supervisor wearing a radio earpiece and an expression that invited no argument. Thomas bent his head slightly. "Miss Whitmore, you requested assistance?" Adrian gave a bright, forced laugh. "Thomas, good to see you. There is just a small misunderstanding here. My wife is overreacting." Thomas did not look at him, keeping his focus entirely on Claire. "Miss Whitmore." Claire handed him the ticket and her access credential. "My assigned seat is being demanded by Miss Vale, who is not listed for this royal box." Bianca's voice rose in panic. "I was invited by Adrian." Thomas finally turned to look at Adrian. Mr. Cross is seated in a 13 as a registered guest of Miss Whitmore," he explained. The sentence was so polite, it took a second for the sting to fully sink in. Adrian's jaw locked. There must be an error. "Cross Global is a tournament partner, a hospitality vendor," Thomas corrected. "Royal Box A is strictly assigned to founding patrons, heads of delegation, and primary legacy sponsors," Thomas added calmly. Claire felt the eyes in the row sharpen toward Adrian. One man in a Federation blazer stopped pretending to check his phone. A former player, 2 seats down, took a slow, deliberate sip of water, his gaze fixed forward with admirable discipline. Adrian lowered his voice, his tone dangerous. "Thomas, I suggest you handle this discreetly." "That is exactly what we are doing," Thomas replied without wavering. The security supervisor stepped half a pace forward. "Miss Vale may be escorted to the guest lounge if she has a valid stadium credential." Bianca looked at Adrian, her eyes wide. "The guest lounge?" The words hurt her more than the insult itself. She had arrived expecting cameras to find her in a royal box. Guest lounge sounded like somewhere people ate stale sandwiches under flickering fluorescent lights. Adrian forced a hollow laugh. "Nobody is moving. We are all adults here." Claire turned to him, her eyes cold. "Then act like one." His eyes flashed with hidden rage. For one dangerous second, she saw the man from their kitchen 2 nights earlier, when he had slammed a cabinet hard enough to crack the hinge because she asked why Bianca was traveling to the final. "You will regret this," he said quietly. Claire looked out at the field as a striker missed a pass by inches. The crowd groaned as one body, a massive collective sigh. "I already do," she replied, "just not in the way you mean." Thomas waited, patient and devastating. Bianca took one step back from the row, her face shifting from smug to brittle. She clutched the champagne flutes, then realized both were empty, and set them on the ledge with a sharp clatter. One tipped, spilling a few drops onto the polished floor. "Adrian," she whispered. "Do something." He looked from Claire to Thomas, from Thomas to the looming cameras, and then from the cameras to the neighboring guests. Calculation moved across his face in quick, ugly pieces. At last he forced a smile again. "Bianca, go ahead to the lounge," he said. "I will sort this out." Bianca stared at him as if he had betrayed her, realizing he had folded much more quickly than she expected. The security supervisor guided her firmly toward the aisle. Bianca passed Claire, walking close enough for the sapphire pendant to brush the edge of Claire's sleeve. A cold reminder of the life Adrian had tried to steal. Claire remained perfectly still, her gaze fixed on the expansive green field below as she spoke. "Leave the necklace." Bianca froze mid-motion, caught in the sudden tension, while Adrian turned a shade of sickly pale. Thomas raised his brows, sensing the shift in the air. Claire finally pivoted to face them. "That sapphire belonged to my mother," she stated, her voice icy and precise. "It was removed from my home safe without any authorization." Bianca reached up, her fingers trembling against the pendant. "Adrian gave it to me," she whispered. "I believe you," Claire said, her eyes hard. "That is why I told you to leave it." Chapter 3. The first goal came 12 minutes later, but Adrian missed the moment entirely. He was stuck in the private corridor, outside Royal Box A, engaged in a heated argument with security, in a voice that desperately tried to remain hushed, though it failed with every passing syllable. Bianca stood silently beside him, the sapphire pendant now sealed inside a clear evidence pouch held firmly by the supervisor. Her neck appeared bare and vulnerable without the jewelry, and her previous confidence seemed to have evaporated. Claire sat motionless in her seat, unmoved by the chaos behind her. When the striker finally curled the ball into the top corner, the stadium erupted with such sheer force that the floor seemed to vibrate beneath her feet. Claire rose instinctively with the roaring crowd. For one fleeting moment, she pushed aside the thought of Adrian, the image of Bianca, the heavy weight of the pendant, and the humiliation that still burned just beneath her ribs. She saw only the sport her father had loved so dearly, the impossible rhythmic precision of a foot meeting a ball at incredible speed, the collective, raw joy of thousands of strangers suddenly becoming one single voice. Then, the replay flashed across the massive stadium screen, and directly beside it appeared the pre-match sponsor montage. The Whitmore Legacy Foundation. For every child who was told the field was not for them. Claire watched as her father's face appeared for 3 seconds in an old archival photograph. His gray hair was windswept, and he was laughing beside a muddy youth pitch, one hand resting the shoulder of a young child clutching a football that looked nearly too large for his small arms. Claire felt a sharp tightness in her throat. Her father, Arthur Whitmore, had built massive shipping lines, sports franchises, medical charities, and a private investment network so expansive that the newspapers called him unreachable. Yet children in small towns knew him as the man who fixed the lights. He believed that sport revealed character faster than any conversation ever could. He had also warned Claire that Adrian Cross admired the victory far more than the effort it took to achieve it. She had married Adrian anyway. Love, she realized with bitter clarity, could be a truly poor scout. At halftime, Thomas Reed returned. "Miss Whitmore," he said gently, "the chairman would like to confirm your attendance at the foundation announcement." Claire cast a quick glance toward the corridor, but Adrian had not returned to his seat. A message from him glowed on her phone screen. "Do not escalate this. We will discuss it at the hotel. If you embarrass Bianca again, I will ensure every camera sees exactly what kind of wife you are." Claire read the threat once, then calmly forwarded it to Eleanor Shaw, her attorney and foundation trustee. Eleanor replied in less than 20 seconds. "Preserved, do not respond. Hydrate." Claire almost let out a laugh. Eleanor's legal advice always included practical, if slightly pointed, threats regarding her client's blood sugar levels. She looked up at Thomas. "Yes, I will attend the announcement. Your father would be very proud to see you there." That simple sentence nearly broke her composure, forcing her to look away to hide the sudden sheen of tears in her eyes. She folded her hands tightly around the small velvet box. He would ask why I waited so long to do this. Thomas, wise enough not to pretend he didn't understand the subtext, simply nodded. By the time the second half began, Adrian returned to the box alone. He sat stiffly in seat A13, no longer touching her, no longer offering fake smiles to the nearby guests. His face held the controlled, rigid expression of a man holding a door shut while a flood of water rose behind it. "You made a scene," he muttered. "You brought one," Claire countered. Bianca is humiliated. Claire watched a midfielder steal the ball cleanly. How difficult for her. "Do you even hear yourself? You sound cruel." She turned to look at him. "You asked me to give my seat to your mistress at a World Cup final, in front of half the business world. Lower your voice. No one can hear me over 90,000 people, but they can certainly see you." "Good." He stared at her, clearly unsettled by the unfamiliar sharp edge in that single word. Adrian's phone buzzed repeatedly in his pocket. Claire caught previews of notifications from his chief operating officer, his assistant, a reporter, and Bianca. Then Bianca again, then a message from Bianca in all caps. He flipped the screen down, agitated. "What is this foundation announcement?" he asked. The question felt far too casual. He had seen the montage. He had finally begun to understand that the event contained rooms he had not been invited into. "It is a commitment to build football facilities in underserved regions," Claire explained. "My father started the fund. I expanded it." "With what money?" he challenged. She looked him in the eye. For years, Adrian had described her wealth as comfortable, old family, and purely decorative. He knew she had trusts, and he knew she sat on various boards. But he had never cared enough to truly understand the scale of her influence. He had been far too busy presenting himself as the self-made genius who graciously tolerated his quiet wife's charitable hobbies. "Enough," she said sharply. "That is not an answer. It is the only one you have earned." His eyes narrowed in frustration. "Claire, we are not enemies." She turned her focus back to the match. "Then why did you bring backup?" In the 70th minute, the stadium camera swept the royal box and faces began appearing on the giant screen. A retired striker, a minister of sport, 2 film stars, and then Adrian. He instantly snapped into a practiced smile. The camera then slid to Claire. She did not smile. She looked calm, elegant, and completely uninterested in helping him perform for the audience. The stadium saw a composed woman in midnight blue silk, wearing a gold pin at her collar, her gaze clear beneath the harsh floodlights. Then the camera shifted to the empty space beside Adrian where Bianca should have been sitting. The crowd did not know the story, but the royal box certainly did. A ripple of whispers moved through the row, and Adrian's smile collapsed just 1 second too late. Chapter 4. Adrian spent the final 15 minutes trying to recover his sense of control without appearing to reach for it. He texted aggressively. He stood once, then quickly sat when Thomas glanced over. He leaned toward Claire twice, only to stop himself because the former player nearby had stopped pretending he wasn't watching the drama unfold. His public mask was still firmly in place, but it no longer fit his face. Claire focused entirely on the field as the match pushed into extra time. Rain began to fall in a fine silver mist through the open roof, glittering brightly in the floodlights. The players moved with exhaustion and pure desperation. Their shirts darkened, their legs grew heavy, and their hunger for the win was unmistakable. Claire loved that part of football the most. It wasn't about the perfection, it was about the reveal. Under real pressure, everyone becomes more honest. Adrian became visibly smaller. In the final minute, a defender cleared a ball right off the line, and the stadium screamed. Claire stood with everyone else, her heart pounding. For a brief breath, she was 16 again beside her father. Her cold hands wrapped around a paper cup of tea, learning that hope could hurt and still be worth having. The whistle blew. The match went to penalties, and Adrian cursed under his breath. He hated uncertainty. Penalties turned billionaires into children and children into prophets, and no amount of money could negotiate with a goalkeeper's raw instinct. Claire watched every single kick. Goal. Goal. A massive save. Goal. The stadium rose and sank in waves. When the final penalty hit the back of the net, half the world seemed to explode at once. Confetti burst into the night sky, and Claire applauded until her palms stung. Adrian did not. His phone had lit up again, and this time the name on the screen was not Bianca. It was Grant Mercer, Global. Adrian ignored it. and Claire noticed. So did Adrian, noticing her notice. "What did you do?" he asked, his voice tight. "I watched football," Claire replied. Before he could say anything more, Thomas appeared at the row entrance with a woman in a black suit who carried a tournament credential. "Miss Whitmore, the post-match presentation team is ready." Adrian stood up immediately. "Presentation." The woman smiled with a professional, practiced air. "Miss Whitmore is scheduled to join the Youth Foundation announcement before the trophy ceremony." Adrian's expression flickered with panic. "I will accompany my wife." "Your credential does not grant you access to the presentation tunnel," the woman said. The words were not loud, but they did not need to be. Adrian looked at Claire, desperate. "Tell them about the last 12 years. Tell them I meant to repair this. Tell them I didn't mean to miss dinner. Tell them the check is coming. Tell them the rumor is false. Tell them my temper is just stress. Tell them I am a good man who made one mistake." Claire simply picked up the velvet box. "Enjoy the trophy ceremony from your seat," she said, and then she walked away. The corridor behind the royal box was cooler and significantly quieter. Staff moved with precise urgency, and screens displayed players embracing on the field. Somewhere beyond the walls, the crowd chanted a name again and again. Thomas walked beside Claire. "Are you all right?" That question had followed her all evening from people who barely knew her, while the man who shared her bed had not asked it once. "I will be," she said. At the tunnel entrance, Eleanor Shaw waited with a tablet tucked under her arm. Eleanor was 60, sharp as a paper cut, and wearing pearls that looked like they had successfully intimidated judges in the past. "You forwarded his message," Eleanor said. "Hello to you too. Hydrate." Claire accepted the water bottle Eleanor thrust into her hand. "Bianca has been escorted to a private lounge, and she is calling Adrian. Adrian is ignoring her, and his publicist is calling everyone. Security has the pendant. Your home safe team confirmed unauthorized access on Tuesday." Claire closed her eyes briefly. "Of course. Also, Grant Mercer has called Adrian 3 times. He has called me once. I did not answer." "Why, Grant?" Eleanor gave her the look she reserved specifically for clients who already knew the answer. Claire knew exactly what was at stake. Cross Global had recently finalized a massive stadium advertising contract valued at nearly $200 million over a 4-year term. The capital backing that expansion arrived via the Whitmore Capital Discretionary Sports Media Fund. Adrian operated under the assumption that the fund was merely a passive investor, a deal facilitated by Grant Mercer. He was blind to the fact that Claire herself chaired the investment committee. He remained oblivious to her past choice to abstain from the original vote solely to avoid a conflict of interest due to their marriage. He didn't know that after tonight, neutrality was no longer an option. "The committee meets tomorrow," Eleanor noted. Claire watched the tunnel open toward the field, where stadium lights flooded the entrance in a harsh, unforgiving white glare. "Move it to tonight." Eleanor offered a thin, approving smile. "It is already handled," she replied. By Chapter 5, as Claire stepped onto the hallowed grass, the stadium remained blissfully unaware of the wreckage of her personal life. That was fine by her. She was not there to collect pity. She walked along the pitch's edge accompanied by 2 youth players selected from the Whitmore Legacy Foundation. There was Sophia, 12, from a coastal town where the local field frequently flooded, and Milo, 11, who had received his first pair of soccer boots from a foundation donation box, his name scrawled in thick black marker. Both children were shaking with nervous excitement. Claire slowed her stride to match their pace. On the giant screen, the celebration highlights faded, replaced by the foundation film. She saw children playing on dusty fields, girls training beneath flickering floodlights, coaches struggling with rusted equipment sheds, and a young boy with missing front teeth shouting in triumph after scoring a goal into a net held together by frayed blue rope. Then, the voice of Arthur Whitmore echoed through the stadium from a vintage interview. "The game does not belong to the powerful," he boomed. "It belongs to anyone brave enough to run toward the ball." Claire paused at the presentation mark, and for a fleeting moment, the weight of her grief surged, so sharp she could taste the bitterness of it. Then Sophia reached out and slipped her small hand into Claire's. Claire looked down, realizing the girl had no idea she was currently saving a billionaire patron from breaking down on global television. She only looked terrified, thrilled, and profoundly alive. Claire squeezed her hand back. The stadium announcer spoke in 3 languages, detailing the expansion of Whitmore Lisa Foundation and its pledge to finance 1,000 community pitches across 40 countries. The number flashed on screen in massive digits. 1,000. High in the royal box, Adrian watched, finally grasping the true scale of her power. Claire could not clearly see his expression from the field, but the broadcast cameras caught every detail. Later, she would learn that his look during that specific announcement became the most replayed image of the entire night, surpassing even the winning team's celebration. The self-made mogul, seated as his wife's guest, found himself staring down at the very woman he had recently commanded to surrender her board chair. Claire opened the velvet box and retrieved her father's gold pin. The presenter invited her to the microphone. She had prepared 2 sentences. After what had transpired in the royal box, she decided on 3. My father believed access changes destiny, she began. Tonight is not about privilege in a box. It is about every child who deserves a field, a coach, and the right to be seen. The stadium erupted in applause. Claire waited, allowing the silence to stretch. No one should ever be pushed out of a place they earned. The applause shifted, deepening as if the crowd sensed a second, sharper meaning despite knowing nothing of the first. In the royal box, Adrian went completely still. The ceremony continued, but the air felt heavy. Sophia and Milo presented a commemorative ball to the tournament chair. Claire stood beside them beneath falling confetti and blinding stadium lights, feeling her old life peeling away in public view, yet no one noticed the hidden blood. Afterward, she retreated through the tunnel where Eleanor stood waiting, phone in hand. The committee is assembled, Eleanor said. Now. Claire followed her into a temporary executive suite that had been converted into a secure private call room. On the screen, 5 members of the Whitmore Capital Sports Media Investment Committee awaited her, all spread as different time zones. Despite the hour, they appeared more alert than anyone had a right to be after midnight. Grant Mercer was absent. Adrian was absent. That was the entire point. Claire sat down, unpinned the gold item from her collar, and placed it on the table. Thank you for joining so quickly, she stated. No one asked for an explanation. They had already seen the social media clips and knew something had gone wrong. Serious people did not need to trade in gossip to identify significant risk. Martin Ellis, the committee's risk chair, spoke first. We have reviewed the initial incident report from Stadium Hospitality. Cross Global's principal attempted to transfer a founding patron seat to an uncredentialed guest and invoked business importance. While doing so, he summarized. That is correct, Claire affirmed. There is also a jewelry matter. Family property was removed from my home safe and given to the same guest. A woman named Priya Shalan leaned forward. Is there any evidence that Cross Global resources were utilized for this? Eleanor answered for her. A preliminary review indicates that Ms. Vale traveled under a Cross Global Executive Hospitality allocation. We are currently requesting the full records. Claire watched the faces on her screen settle into that specific look investors wore when a personal scandal transformed into a genuine governance crisis. Martin noted that the stadium advertising facility agreement includes specific morality and executive conduct provisions. It does, Claire confirmed. Do you intend to recuse yourself? She had anticipated the question regarding any vote directly affecting Adrian's personal standing. Yes, she replied. From protecting Whitmore Capital's exposure? No, I will not let my marriage become a blind spot for this firm. Priya nodded slowly. That is the correct distinction. For the next 40 minutes, they meticulously reviewed triggers, exposure, reputational risk, and potential alternatives. The decision lacked all theatricality. Money rarely moved to the sound of music. It moved through legal clauses, strict timelines, and signatures. By the end, Cross Global's funding draw was frozen, pending a full executive review. The Adrian Stadium contract would be subject to an immediate enhanced audit. Grant Mercer would be notified before sunrise. No public statement would be issued unless Cross Global lied first. Claire stood up as the call concluded. Eleanor watched her with a guarded look. You handled that exceptionally well, she said. I hated every single second of it, Claire replied. That often improves judgment, Eleanor noted. Claire looked toward the stadium tunnel where the cheers still echoed. He truly thought a seat was the insult, she said. He never realized the seat was evidence. Chapter 6. Adrian found her just outside the executive suite. His bow tie was loosened, and his hair, once perfect at the start of the evening, now hung slightly over his forehead. He looked handsome still, which annoyed her more than it should have. Betrayal did not always have the decency to make a man look ugly. "We need to talk," he said. Eleanor stepped forward immediately. "Not without counsel," she warned. Adrian ignored her completely. "Claire, please." The words sounded foreign in his mouth, like a language he was merely borrowing. Claire felt exhausted. The match, the seat, the necklace, the ceremony on the field, the emergency call, everything had compressed into a hard, bright stone behind her ribs. 5 minutes, she said. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. In the open corridor, Claire added firmly, "With witnesses." Adrian's face tightened at the mention of witnesses, but he nodded. They walked a short distance away from the suite. Staff moved around them with professional discretion. The stadium had begun to empty, leaving behind distant chants, discard programs, and the sharp metallic scent of rain on concrete. Adrian spoke first. "I made a mistake." Claire waited, watching him. "A terrible mistake?" he added quickly. "Which one?" His mouth opened, then closed. That was the inherent problem with calling a pattern of behavior a mistake. When asked to name the specific instance, the lie became clumsy. "Bringing Bianca," he said into the seat. He looked visibly irritated now. His humility had very shallow roots. "The necklace," he added. "And Claire, I am trying to fix this." "No," she said. "You are simply listing the things you got caught doing." Color flushed along his cheekbones. "You humiliated me in front of the entire stadium," he spat. There it was, the true wound. Not that he had hurt her. Not that he had brought a mistress into her father's memorial event. Not that he had brazenly stolen from her family's private safe. His pain only existed where cameras could notice the consequences. "You were seated in Royal Box A only because of me," Claire said quietly. "You attempted to remove me from my own seat, in front of my father's foundation guests, in front of the tournament staff, who have known my family for decades. What exactly did you expect me to protect?" "Our marriage," he pleaded. The word almost made her laugh. Not because marriage was funny, but because his version of it had become completely absurd. "You brought Bianca to sit beside you," she continued. "It was complicated," he muttered. "It was simple enough for her to wear my mother's sapphire," she countered. Adrian looked away. Claire studied him closely. "Did she know?" "No." "What, that the necklace was mine?" He hesitated. The answer hurt, though not as much as she had expected. "You told her," Claire stated. "She asked where it came from, and you said what?" His silence completed the sentence for her. Claire imagined Bianca fastening the pendant around her own throat, enjoying not only the jewel but the power behind it. The intimacy of theft, the small, sharp violence of wearing another woman's family history as mere decoration. "I wanted in writing that you removed the necklace from my safe," Claire said. "That is completely unnecessary," he argued. "It is necessary for you," she corrected. Adrian's eyes sharpened. "Meaning?" "Meaning I am giving you one chance to tell the truth before the security report tells it for you." For the first time since he found her, genuine fear moved across his face. "You would really call the police?" "I have not decided yet." "Over a necklace?" Claire's voice dropped to a cold, steady level. "Over my mother's necklace? Over my home safe? Over the fact that you thought anything connected to me was yours to redistribute as you pleased?" He dragged a hand over his mouth in frustration. "God, Claire, listen to yourself. You sound exactly like your father. That was meant to wound her, to diminish her, but it steadied her instead." "Thank you," she said. Adrian's phone rang. Grant Mercer again. This time, Adrian answered it, perhaps hoping to regain some masculine terrain in front of her. "Grant, not now," he barked. Claire could not hear every word from the other end, but she heard enough. "Frozen, review, conduct clause, board, morning." Adrian's face lost its color in stages, the blood draining away until he looked like a statue caught in a harsh spotlight. He turned, attempting to shield himself, but the corridor was far too wide and open for the kind of secrets he needed to keep. No, that is not necessary," he stammered. "This is just a domestic matter. Claire is merely upset. She will clarify everything." Claire didn't blink. She lifted her chin, eyes sharp. Grant must have hissed something cutting because Adrian's shoulders coiled tight. "She chairs what?" Adrian finally asked, his voice cracking. There it was, the missing, jagged piece of the puzzle finally sliding into the room. Adrian pivoted toward Claire, his phone still pressed to his ear. For 12 years, he had believed he understood the power dynamic in their marriage. He was the architect, she was the woman with quiet hobbies. He generated wealth, she preserved legacy, he moved the markets. She was the one who signed checks for children in museums. Now, Grant Mercer was coldly explaining that the stadium deal, the massive expansion loan, and the future he had meticulously engineered all rested under the signature authority of the wife he had just ordered to stand aside. Adrian ended the call without even a goodbye. Whitmore Capital, he stated, the name sounding like a curse in his mouth. Claire remained motionless. You chair the sports media fund, he accused. Yes, she replied. Since when? Before you even applied for the financing, his expression twisted in disgust. You let me pitch to your own people like an absolute fool. You pitched to a committee, Claire corrected. I recused myself from the original vote because of our marriage. But you knew all along. Yes. And you said nothing. Claire felt a cold, exhausted anger settle into her bones, clear and lethal. Adrian, you have spent years dismissing my work as sentimental, she said, her voice steady. You skipped every foundation briefing. You openly mocked my board packets. You told everyone I did good works because I lacked the appetite for real business. Do not blame me because you were too arrogant to look at every door with my name on it. He stared at her as if she had slapped him across the face. Then, because he was Adrian, he reached for the accusation that best protected his fragile pride. You trapped me. Claire shook her head slowly. No, I simply stopped cushioning the floor for you. Chapter 7. By morning, the photograph was everywhere. It wasn't the one Claire expected, not the stadium camera. It was a shot of Adrian sitting beside an empty seat looking small and defeated. It wasn't the clip of Claire on the field that set the internet on fire. It wasn't even the image of Bianca leaving the royal box without the sapphire pendant. The photograph that traveled fastest showed Adrian leaning over Claire in Royal Box A, his hand clamped tight around her arm. Bianca stood beside him, holding champagne with a smug, satisfied smile. Someone had snapped it from 2 rows back during the anthem. The caption wrote itself in 100 languages. World Cup VIP drama. Business mogul appears to force wife from her seat for a younger woman. By 9, the Cross Global Communications Department issued a desperate statement calling the incident a private misunderstanding among friends. At 9:15, tournament hospitality officials officially declined to confirm that description. At 9:20, the Whitmore Legacy Foundation released its own statement, thanking all attendees for supporting global youth football and confirming that founding patron seating was strictly non-transferable for security and protocol reasons. It did not name Adrian. It did not need to. At 10, Bianca posted a photo of herself from the hotel balcony wearing oversized sunglasses and no necklace. The caption read, "People always hate the woman who is loved." By 10:12, online comments had identified her as the uncredentialed guest removed from the royal box. By 10:30, she deleted the post. Claire watched none of this voluntarily. Eleanor summarized it while Claire sat at breakfast in the hotel suite, wearing a cream sweater, hair damp from the shower, eyes gritty from 3 hours of fitful sleep. I would prefer a war room with less fruit, Eleanor remarked, looking down at the lavish, untouched breakfast spread. Eat the berries, Claire muttered. I am not here for antioxidants. You are always here for antioxidants, Eleanor countered. You just call them evidence. Eleanor gave her a sharp look, then casually took a blackberry. Across the table, Thomas Reed had sent a formal incident report. It confirmed Bianca's credential status, Adrian's arrogant demand, Claire's seat assignment, and the recovery of the pendant. The security footage from the corridor showed Bianca admitting Adrian gave her the necklace. It also captured Adrian saying, Claire does not need family relics to watch a game. Claire read that line twice, family relics. Her mother had worn the sapphire the night Arthur proposed. Claire had worn it at her parents' anniversary dinner the year before her mother died. It was not the most expensive jewel in the Whitmore collection, but grief does not appraise by market value. Adrian had known that. The suite doorbell rang softly. Eleanor checked her phone. Your brother? Claire frowned. He had flown in, apparently armed with opinions. Julian Whitmore entered wearing travel clothes, a dark coat, and the expression of a man who had been simmering with rage across 2 continents. He was Claire's older brother by 4 years, a former professional goalkeeper whose career-ending knee injury had been his only defeat until now. He now ran Whitmore Logistics with the calm, terrifying menace of a man who had once thrown himself at flying objects for fun. He crossed the room and hugged Claire without asking. She held herself together until his hand touched the back of her head. Then, something inside her finally softened and shook. Julian said quietly, "I should have been here. It was a football match, not a duel." Apparently, it became both, Eleanor said, sipping coffee. "Family support is moving. Keep it useful," she advised. Julian looked at her. "Good morning to you too, Eleanor. It would be better if men stopped creating this kind of paperwork." He sat beside Claire and picked up the incident report. His face darkened as he read the details. "I am going to break his jaw," Julian muttered. "No," Claire and Eleanor said in perfect unison. Julian exhaled through his nose. "Fine, I will imagine it." "Imagine quietly," Eleanor remarked dryly. Claire leaned back, closing her eyes. "I need strategy, not revenge." Julian's expression softened. "You can have both. Strategy first." They spent the morning reviewing the moving pieces. The cross-global board had already scheduled an emergency session. Whitmore Capital would require a full independent investigation before releasing any further funds. Tournament partners were distancing themselves. Bianca's publicist was trying to sell a story that she had been misled by Adrian about the state of his marriage. "Was she?" Julian asked. Claire stared at the report. "Maybe in part, but not enough." The distinction mattered. Bianca had knowingly enjoyed the humiliation, but Adrian had likely lied to her, too. He lied the way some men breathed, not always with planning, but sometimes simply because the truth required him to share space with another person's dignity. At noon, Adrian arrived at the suite. Julian rose so fast his chair scraped the floor. Eleanor warned, "No jaws." Adrian entered with Grant Mercer and a woman Claire did not recognize. Grant looked furious. The woman introduced herself as Mira Coleman, outside counsel for the cross-global board. Adrian looked at Julian, then at Claire. "You brought your brother." Julian smiled without warmth. "You brought your mistress to my father's foundation night." Grant Mercer closed his eyes briefly, as if begging the ceiling for a new set of executives. Mira set her briefcase on the table. "We are here to discuss containment." Claire looked at her steadily. "Containment of what?" "Reputational damage, financing risk, and any potential personal legal claims between the parties." Mira listed. Eleanor put down her coffee. "What a tidy phrase for theft, coercion, and public humiliation." Mira did not flinch. "I am not minimizing the concerns. I am trying to prevent an escalation that harms every single stakeholder." Claire respected the honesty of that, if not the convenience. Adrian sat down without being invited. "I will issue an apology," he said. Claire waited. "A public one," he added. Still, she waited. "And Bianca will confirm she misunderstood the seating," he continued. Julian laughed once. A sharp sound. "Did she misunderstand the necklace too?" Adrian's eyes flicked toward him. "Stay out of my marriage." Julian leaned forward. "You carried your affair into my sister's seat. You left the marriage in the aisle." Grant slammed a hand lightly on the table, loud enough to stop the exchange. "Adrian, enough. That was new." Adrian looked genuinely shocked. Grant turned to Claire. "What do you want?" It was the first useful question anyone on Adrian's side had asked. Claire folded her sips. "I want the necklace returned through counsel. I want a written admission that Adrian removed it from my safe. I want Cross-Global to preserve all communications involving Bianca's travel, hospitality, compensation, and access. I want Adrian removed from any matter involving Whitmore Capital exposure pending review. I want no public statement suggesting I caused this by misunderstanding, jealousy, or marital instability." Mira wrote quickly. Adrian's voice was low. "And personally?" Claire looked at him. "Personally, I want you to stop assuming there is a private version of me who will clean up after the public version of you." Chapter 8. Adrian's apology was posted at 3 in the afternoon. It was not good. It was too polished, too lawyered, too full of passive constructions. Mistakes were made. Emotions ran high. A private matter became visible in an unfortunate setting. He regretted any discomfort caused to his wife, Miss Claire Whitmore. Miss, not beloved wife, not partner, not even Claire. Miss Claire Whitmore, as if she were a mere institution he had inconvenienced. Eleanor read it and said he wants credit for apologizing without actually admitting to any verbs. Julian added, I still have the jaw option. Claire did not laugh. The apology left her colder than ice. It showed that Adrian still believed language could polish rot. The internet noticed too. By evening, commentators were dissecting the statement line by line. Football fans, who could forgive a bad pass but never cowardice under pressure, mocked the phrasing. Business journalists were obsessed with the sudden financing freeze at Cross Global. Fashion bloggers were busy identifying the designer suit Bianca wore, then the glaring absence of the sapphire necklace. A retired goalkeeper with 16 million followers had posted, if you make your wife leave her seat for your mistress, at least do not choose a seat she owns. The post went viral instantly. Claire should have felt vindicated by the public outcry, but instead she felt exposed. This sympathy was just another kind of crowding. Strangers were defending her, yet they were also consuming the worst night of her marriage like sports highlights. At 6, she went alone to the empty seat. Thomas arranged the access without a single word of judgment. The final cleanup crews had nearly finished their work. Rows of empty seats stretched out in silence under the tight sky. Confetti clung to the corners like bright, exhausted insects. The field was covered for maintenance, hidden away. Without the thousands of fans, the stadium felt less like a cathedral and more like a human body. After the fever of the event, Claire walked to the royal box. The seat from day 12 waited exactly where she had left it. She sat there for several minutes, allowing herself to process the ordinary brutal facts. Leather beneath her hands, cool air on her face, the dull ache behind her eyes. No cameras, no Adrian, no Bianca. No one asking she wanted this Mistress. The seat was famous overnight, but it was just a chair. The wound was not the furniture. It was being forced to disappear from a life she had built. Her phone buzzed. Bianca. Claire almost ignored the call. Curiosity, unfortunately, was one of those less dignified survival instincts that never quite went away, she answered. Bianca's voice sounded significantly smaller than it had in the royal box. I know you do not want to hear from me. Correct. I am not calling to ask for forgiveness. Good. A long pause followed. Adrian told me your marriage was over. Claire looked out over the empty, dark field. Did he tell you that before or after he gave you my mother's necklace? Bianca inhaled shakily. Before and after. How convenient. I knew it was wrong, Bianca said, gesturing toward the seat. The necklace. The way he talked about you. I told myself you were cold, that you cared more about your foundation than him, that maybe he deserved real happiness. Claire did not answer. She had no interest in making this confession comfortable for the woman on the other end of the line. Bianca continued. Last night when he sent me to the lounge, I finally understood something. He did not choose me. He used me to hurt you, then dropped me the second I became inconvenient. That sounded painfully true. It did not absolve her, though. Why are you calling? Because Cross Global's counsel wants me to sign a statement saying I misunderstood everything and acted alone with the seating staff. Adrian's assistant sent me the draft. Claire's eyes closed. Of course, do not sign it. No, get a lawyer. I did. Then listen to them. Bianca's voice cracked. I am sorry about the necklace. Claire opened her eyes. Across the stadium, workers moved in orange vests. You were only sorry when it became evidence, Claire said. I hope someday you become sorry because it was cruel. Bianca was silent for a long time. Then quietly, she replied, I hope so too. The call ended. Claire sat in seat A12 until the sky turned black. When she finally rose, she did not feel stronger. Strength was not a clean, upward line of progress. Some days, it was simply leaving the place of your own humiliation without hating the version of yourself who had once stayed too long. At the exit, Thomas waited for her. Miss Whitmore, he said, your car is ready. She looked back one last time at the royal box. Thank you, Thomas. For what? For asking me, not him. His expression softened always. Chapter 9. The Cross Global Board met in London 2 days later. Claire did not attend in person. She had no desire to sit across from Adrian while his directors learned the difference between a scandal and a crisis. Instead, she joined by video link from the Whitmore Capital Conference Room with Eleanor beside her and the Sports Media Committee assembled around the long black table. Adrian appeared on another screen. He wore a charcoal suit and the practiced expression of a man who had rehearsed his remorse in a mirror. Behind him sat Mira Coleman and Grant Mercer. Grant looked as if he had aged 6 months since the final match. The board chair, Helena Frost, opened the meeting with clipped, cold efficiency. This meeting concerns executive conduct, financing exposure, and the reputational risk arising from the World Cup final incident. Adrian's jaw tightened at the word incident. Claire noticed it immediately. So did Eleanor. Helena continued, "Mr. Cross, you may begin now." Adrian leaned forward into the camera. "I accept responsibility for mishandling a personal matter in a public setting. However, I strongly object to attempts to convert a private marital breakdown into a corporate crisis." There it was, the line. He had chosen it carefully because it made everyone else sound invasive and unreasonable. Claire kept her face entirely still. Adrian went on, claiming that Cross Global's fundamentals remained strong. "Our stadium advertising technology performed flawlessly during the tournament. No client contract was impaired in any way. I have apologized publicly, and I am prepared to take additional personal steps to resolve these matters with my wife." Helena looked directly at Claire. "Miss Whitmore, the floor is yours." Claire spoke clearly and coldly. "Whitmore Capital did not freeze the funding draw because Adrian embarrassed me. It froze the draw because the executive responsible for contract performance attempted to misuse tournament hospitality credentials, involved an unregistered guest in a restricted seating area, allegedly transferred family property under disputed circumstances, and may have used company resources for that guest's travel and access." Adrian's eyes flashed with anger. "Allegedly," Eleanor said, while notes flashed on the screen. Preserved messages reduced the comfort of that word. Helena Frost turned to Mira. "Have communications been preserved?" Mira nodded. "A litigation hold has been issued. Has Ms. Vale's travel been reviewed?" Mira's hesitation did not help Adrian. "There are expenses requiring further review," she said. Grant Mercer closed his eyes. Adrian spoke sharply, trying to interrupt. "Bianca did legitimate consulting work." Claire said, "What specific deliverables did she produce?" He looked at her with pure disdain. "A campaign concept," he said. Eleanor tapped her tablet. The file labeled Campaign Concept was created yesterday at 11:43 p.m. Silence filled the room. Claire almost admired the pure absurdity of it. Adrian had once built genuine things. Somewhere along the way, he had become a man who believed documents created after exposure could rewrite history. Helena Frost's voice cooled. "Mr. Cross, did you instruct staff to create retroactive materials?" Adrian looked toward Mira for help. Mira's face remained professionally blank, but her shoulders held the tension of counsel discovering new liability in real time. "I asked the team to gather relevant materials," Adrian said weakly. Claire said, "That was not the question." He glared at her. "You are enjoying this, aren't you?" The room went deadly still. Claire felt the old tired instinct to soften, to rescue him from his own sentence before it damaged his reputation further. Then she let it pass. "No," she said, "I am documenting it." Helena Frost leaned back. "The board will enter executive session now. Mr. Cross, please remain available online." Adrian looked genuinely stunned. "You are removing me from my own board meeting temporarily," Helena said, "pending discussion of matters involving your conduct." His screen went dark. For 3 seconds, absolutely no one spoke. Then Grant Mercer muttered, finally. It was quiet enough that perhaps he forgot the microphone's leave. It was also loud enough for everyone to hear. The board's executive session lasted 90 minutes. During that time, Whitmore Capital presented its risk assessment. The committee did not demand Adrian's complete destruction. It demanded governance controls, temporary suspension from contract oversight, an independent review of hospitality expenditures, board approval for all communications related to the incident, and the appointment of an interim operating lead for the Stadium Technology Division. The cross-global directors pushed back in entirely predictable ways. It is too disruptive, they argued. Too public, too harsh for one personal scandal. Claire answered each concern with the same calm she had once wasted on dinner-table arguments. If an executive misuses access at the highest-profile event in global sport, clients will ask whether access controls matter anywhere else. If personal relationships are routed through company hospitality, auditors will ask where the boundaries are. If a CEO responds to exposure by attempting to create retroactive documentation, lenders will ask what else has been backfilled. No raised voice, no tears, no dramatic accusation, just doors closing. At last, Helena Frost returned with the board decision. Adrian would be placed on immediate administrative leave from all matters connected to the stadium contract. An independent firm would review all expenses and communications. Cross Global would appoint Grant Mercer as the interim executive contact for Whitmore Capital. Adrian would be prohibited from making further public statements about Claire, Bianca, or the incident without board approval. Adrian reappeared on screen to hear the verdict. His face changed as each condition landed. "This is excessive," he said. Helena answered. "No, this is late." Claire looked down at her hands. The sentence hit harder than she expected because it was true in more rooms than one. After the meeting ended, Eleanor gathered her papers. "How do you feel?" Claire watched Adrian's blank screen, like someone who had finally turned on the lights in a dark room. "I kept cleaning in the dark." Chapter 10. Adrian showed up 3 nights later. He did not go to the hotel suite or the public rooms where my lawyers could easily intercept him. Instead, he arrived at the London townhouse, the one Claire had inherited from her grandmother, appearing just after 9 with no warning, and a bouquet of white roses that looked expensive enough to be mistaken for sincerity. Claire watched him on the security camera. For a fleeting second, memory tried to make him look familiar. She saw Adrian in Lisbon on their honeymoon, laughing as the rain ruined his designer shoes. Adrian asleep with a thick book balanced on his chest. Adrian holding her tight after her father's funeral, whispering that she would never have to handle the weight of the family empire alone. Then the monitor captured the roses, and the illusion shattered. She remembered he had sent the exact same arrangement to Bianca's suite after the royal box incident. An assistant had mistakenly copied that receipt into the preservation file, a small digital breadcrumb of his betrayal. Memory retreated, replaced by cold reality. Claire opened the intercom. "Why are you here?" Adrian looked directly into the camera lens to speak to my wife. "Your wife is counsel, Adrian. Please, no cameras, no lawyers. Just 10 minutes. She almost refused, but then realized she felt no fear, only a profound exhaustion and a sudden, sharp curiosity about which version of him would finally emerge when he no longer had a stage to perform on. She let him in and led him to the front sitting room. Leaving Marcus, the security lead Julian had hired, stationed firmly in the hallway. Claire did not apologize for the security. Adrian noticed immediately. "You have guards now," he observed. "I have boundaries now," she countered. He set the bouquet on a side table. Claire refused to touch them. The room was small by Whitmore standards, which was still larger than most people's apartments, with shelves of books lining one wall and her mother's piano sitting near the window. A framed photo of Arthur Whitmore at a youth match rested on the mantel. Adrian glanced at the image and flinched, almost imperceptibly. "I forgot the public announcement was about him," he muttered. Claire sat across from him. "You did not forget," she said quietly. "You never truly learned." He accepted the harsh truth with a small, defeated nod that genuinely surprised her. "I have been trying to understand how it got this bad," he admitted. Claire waited. "That sounds like an excuse," he finally admitted. "It is," she replied. He rubbed his hands together, his gaze fixed on the floor. He looked weary in a way no amount of grooming or expensive tailoring could conceal. "Bianca was not the beginning," he started. My chest tightened. "Honesty, even when it comes far too late, still has teeth." "No," she said. "You are proof of the end." He looked up, confused. "Proof of what? That you wanted an audience more than a partner?" Adrian winced. "I loved you," he insisted. "Maybe you do not believe that." Claire considered lying out of a sense of mercy, but then she remembered the seat in the stadium. "I believe you loved the version of me who made your life smoother. The wife who showed up to events, remembered birthdays, handled donors, charmed investors, and never asked too publicly why your assistant booked one bedroom less than you actually needed." His face hardened. "I did not plan to humiliate you that night." "That is not comforting," she said. "I thought you would move seats. I thought we would argue about it later. I thought—" He stopped, the frustration and shame working visibly in his jaw. "I thought you always chose dignity over conflict." "I did," she said. "Then why not that night?" Claire looked toward the mantel. "Because you confused dignity with disappearance." Adrian's eyes reddened. For a brief second, she saw genuine grief, but she no longer trusted grief that only arrived once the consequences were laid out before him. I ended it with Bianca, he said. That is your business now. I returned everything through counsel. Yes. Good. He leaned forward. Is there any way back for us? The question hung in the air, finding no place to land. In those early, frantic imaginings, she had been angrier, grander, more theatrical. She had prepared a sentence that would cut him cleanly in half, but reality offered only a tired woman in a chair, exhausted from too many meetings, looking at a man she had once loved but could no longer trust with her own shadow. Back to what? She asked him. He did not answer. Back to me editing myself just so you feel large? Back to pretending your temper is just professional pressure? Back to explaining away the women who orbit you because I do not want to seem insecure? Back to being the quiet wife? You can move out of a seat, Adrian, but you cannot move out of your own choices. His mouth trembled once. I'm sorry, he said. The apology finally sounded real. It also arrived in a room that was already completely emptied. I believe you are sorry tonight, Claire said. I just do not believe sorrow can act as a bridge by itself. What do you want me to do? Tell the truth, she replied, without requiring a reward. He looked at her for a long, heavy moment. And if I do? There it was, the small, selfish negotiation hidden inside his remorse. Claire stood up. Then you will have finally done one decent thing. Adrian closed his eyes. When he opened them, he looked almost young, almost lost. I do not know who I am if I lose all this. Claire's voice softened despite herself. Then find out, she said, without using me as proof. He left the roses. After the door closed, Claire had Marcus throw them away. She upstairs, opened the safe, and placed her mother's sapphire pendant back into its velvet tray. For the first time since the final, I cried. It was not because the necklace was safe, but because I finally understood that I had not been. Chapter 11. The divorce petition was filed on a Tuesday morning without a single press release. Claire refused to announce it like a new product launch. Eleanor filed the papers quietly, citing irretrievable breakdown, misconduct, misuse of marital property, and protective financial separation. Adrian was served while at the temporary office of Cross Global. He did not call Claire afterward. That was either a sign of personal growth or very strict legal advice. Claire chose to accept both. The news leaked within hours regardless. By then, the public had already shifted from initial shock to ruthless analysis. Some people even called Claire cold for acting so quickly. Others asked why she had not left him sooner. A few online critics suggested she had orchestrated the stadium incident just to take control of Adrian's company. Julian read one of those comments aloud at lunch and nearly snapped his fork in two. Claire took the phone from him. Stop reading strangers, she said. Strangers are idiots. Often that does not require our active supervision. Eleanor, who had joined them to review the settlement terms, remarked, actually, one should supervise idiots when they sign affidavits. Otherwise, it is best to ignore them entirely. The divorce itself was significantly more complex than the tabloids expected. Adrian had built Cross Global before the marriage, but its expansion had been supported by the introductions, credit lines, and credibility Claire quietly provided. She did not want half of everything for sport. She wanted a clean separation, the return of her personal property, reimbursement for misused assets, and a permanent end to Adrian using her name as silent collateral. Adrian's first settlement proposal was truly insulting. He included a mutual non-disparagement clause so broad it would have prevented Claire from answering basic questions about the World Cup final. He wanted no formal admission regarding the stolen necklace. He wanted continued access to certain Whitmore sporting contacts for ongoing cross-global contracts. He even wanted the London townhouse listed as a marital residence, despite knowing full well it belonged to a premarital trust. Eleanor read the proposal, slowly removed her glasses, and said, "This is not a settlement. It is a burglary wearing cologne." Claire rejected it immediately. The second proposal improved significantly because the Cross Global Board pressured Adrian to reduce his personal litigation risk. The independent review had found various hospitality expenses tied to Bianca, multiple retroactive documentation attempts, and unauthorized use of executive access. Adrian remained on forced leave. Grant Mercer had successfully stabilized operations without him, which was excellent for the company, and absolutely terrible for Adrian's fragile ego. Claire learned these details through formal updates. She took no pleasure in his fall, or rather, she took only a very measured amount of satisfaction, then returned to her work. The Whitmore Legacy Foundation became the one place where the scandal was transformed into something genuinely useful. Donations poured in after the final. Some came from wealthy viewers embarrassed by the story, but more came from ordinary football fans who sent $10, $20, or $50 with heartfelt notes. "No woman should lose her seat," one note read. "For my daughter, build a field where girls do not have to ask for permission," another said. Claire read those notes late at night, and they humbled her. Her public humiliation had become a doorway for people she would never actually meet. She did not romanticize. Pain did not become good just because it produced donations. But if the pain was already present, she realized she could choose exactly where it flowed. 3 months after the final, Claire traveled to the first new pitch funded after the match. It was in a small coastal city, where the old field had been nothing but gravel and broken glass. The new one was modest, bright, and crowded with children long before the ribbon could even be cut. Sophia, the girl from the ceremony, was there with her team. "Do you remember me?" Sophia asked, looking up at her. Claire smiled warmly. "You saved me from crying on live television." Sophia looked genuinely alarmed. "I did it very gracefully," Claire added. The girl seemed pleased but confused, which was exactly the appropriate reaction to adult emotional complexity. During the ribbon ceremony, a local coach thanked the foundation for finally giving the children a safe place to run. Claire stood beside him, the wind lifting her hair, and realized she had not thought about Adrian for nearly 40 minutes. That felt like a victory that no newspaper headline could ever understand. After the ceremony, as children flooded the field, Eleanor approached with her phone. Adrian had finally accepted the revised settlement framework. Claire watched Sophia sprint after a ball, her ponytail flying in the wind. All material terms, were met. The admission regarding the necklace, the reimbursement. No contact except through counsel for divorce matters, no use of Whitmore contacts. No public statements without mutual review. He keeps his premarital equity, but it is now subject to strict board restrictions. You walk away clean. Clean. The word felt both impossible and necessary. "Good," Claire said. Eleanor studied her face carefully. "That is all?" Claire looked back at the field. "That is enough." Chapter 12. The final divorce hearing took place in a private courtroom with far fewer cameras outside than anyone had expected. Scandals have notoriously short attention spans. By then, another athlete had already retired. Another high-profile billionaire had been served, the latest in a string of public marriage collapses that the tabloid press consumed with ravenous hunger. The world had moved on, shifting its attention toward the next scandal, and Claire found a strange, cold mercy in that indifference. Adrian arrived at the legal offices, accompanied by Mira Coleman and a high-priced family law attorney. He looked leaner now, his presence diminished, quieter, and stripped of the polished, expensive lacquer he once wore like armor. His wedding ring was gone. Claire had removed hers weeks ago, tucking it into a drawer, alongside old, forgotten match tickets. It was not out of sentiment, she simply did not know what to do with the heavy metal that had once outlived a promise. The judge moved through the settlement with efficient, surgical precision. The return of personal property was acknowledged. Financial claims were finally resolved. Confidential details were sealed tight. The non-disparagement clause was strictly limited to false statements, protecting truth rather than shielding reputation. There was a no-contact provision in place and no admission of criminal liability. Yet the document contained a written, undeniable acknowledgement regarding the unauthorized removal of the sapphire pendant from the Whitmore safe. Claire listened to the proceedings without a flicker of expression, keeping her gaze steady while Adrian stared at the mahogany table for the duration of the reading. When the judge formally asked whether both parties were entering into this agreement of their own free will, Adrian answered with a clipped yes. Claire gave the same reply. A single syllable to end 12 years of life together. Afterward, in the sterile silence of the corridor, Adrian approached her with heavy, hesitant steps. Eleanor moved closer, her protective instinct flaring, though she did not interrupt. "Claire," he said, his voice barely a rasp. She turned to face him, He reached into his coat and held out a small, plain envelope. "My statement, the truthful one," he said. "I already sent it to counsel. This copy is for you." Claire did not reach for it immediately, her fingers frozen. "What does it say?" she asked. "Does it say I misused my position at the tournament? Does it admit I attempted to pressure you out of a seat that was rightfully yours? Does it confess I removed your mother's necklace without your permission? That Bianca did not act alone? That my public apology was a lie?" Her throat tightened, the weight of the past crashing down in a sudden, suffocating wave. "Why are you giving this to me now?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. He looked away, focusing on the windows at the end of the corridor. "Because for months I kept telling myself that the truth was just another currency, something I could trade to get the result I wanted. Then I realized you were right. It is not currency. It is just something I owe." Claire finally accepted the envelope, its surface cool against her skin. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded, his eyes lingering on her face, searching for some trace of softness, perhaps hoping for the woman who once would have turned a single decent gesture into a bridge back to him. She gave him neither cruelty nor an invitation. "I hope you become better than the man I saw that night," she said. Adrian swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Do you hate me?" he asked. Claire considered the question, examining the wreckage of their history. Hatred had certainly visited her, she realized. It had stood in her doorway for weeks, wearing Bianca's perfume and her mother's stolen sapphire. It had offered her a cold, sharp energy back when grief had left her feeling hollow and weak. But hatred was a greedy guest. It wanted to pay rent in her future, and Claire was finished giving away rooms in her mind to ghosts. "No," she said clearly. "I do not trust you. That is different." He nodded slowly, as if the distinction hurt him more, because he knew it was fair. They parted there without an embrace or a lingering look. Outside, a soft rain fell against the courthouse steps. Claire stood under the awning, waiting while Eleanor's driver pulled the car to the curb. Eleanor glanced at the envelope in Claire's hand. "Do you want to read it now?" she asked. "No," Claire replied. "Good," Eleanor said. "The car has biscuits." "You brought legal biscuits?" Claire asked, a faint smile touching her lips. "Emotional support biscuits," Eleanor clarified. Claire laughed, and the sound startled her. It was not grand or cinematic, but it was profoundly, undeniably real. That evening, back in the silence of the London townhouse, she finally sat down to read Adrian's statement alone. It was written in plain, unvarnished language, devoid of poetry or pathetic excuses. He used active verbs, refusing to hide behind the passive voice. "I did this. I took that. I pressured them." He confessed to lying by omission, writing, "I allowed my wife to be humiliated because preserving my image mattered more to me than preserving her dignity." Claire cried again, but the tears felt different this time. Not because the apology fixed the broken past, but because the past had finally stopped arguing with her. She folded the statement neatly and placed it in a file. Then she opened the drawer, took out her wedding ring, placed it in a small envelope, and wrote a single word on the front, "Finished." Chapter 13. 1 year after that chaotic World Cup final, Claire returned to another stadium. It was not nearly as grand as the last one. There was no royal box, no heads of state, and no camera crane drifting like a mechanical bird over a crowd of jeweled guests. This stadium held only 12,000 people on a good day and smelled faintly of buttery popcorn, dampened grass, and fresh, vibrant paint. It stood in a city that had never hosted a final and certainly never expected to, which was exactly why Claire liked it. The Whitmore Legacy Foundation was celebrating the opening of its 100th new community pitch, built right beside the stadium complex for the local youth leagues. Children crowded the sidelines in bright, oversized kits, while parents waved paper flags in the breeze. Coaches shouted instructions that absolutely no one obeyed, because the sheer excitement had made all sense of structure purely theoretical. Claire wore a simple navy dress and her father's gold pin. The sapphire pendant remained at home in its safe. Some heirlooms simply needed their rest. Julian stood beside her, holding a paper cup of lukewarm coffee. "No VIP box tonight?" he joked. "I am allergic," Claire replied. "Understandable," he muttered. Eleanor arrived, carrying a clipboard despite the fact that she had an entire office staff for clipboard-related activities. "The mayor wants a photo," she announced, "and the girls' team wants you to take the first penalty kick." I advised them that your left foot is historically unreliable, but they insisted. Traitorous fiduciary, Claire teased. She looked across the field and spotted Sophia, now 13, carefully tying the laces of a younger player's boots. The girl had grown taller, sharper, and carried herself with a new sense of confidence. She waved the moment she spotted Claire. For a brief second, the crushing memory of Royal Box AZ returned to her. Adrienne's hand firm on her arm, Bianca's calculated smile, the deafening roar of the anthem, and the cruel command to stand and perform. The memory was there, but it no longer owned her body. It was merely a ghost, unable to move her or dim her light. That, Claire realized, was what healing truly felt like when it was honest. It was not about forgetting what had happened, nor was it about forgiving on a preset schedule. It was simply becoming too difficult for the old pain to steer her life. The ceremony began, and the mayor delivered a speech filled with far too many adjectives. Julian leaned in to whisper cynical commentary until Claire elbowed him, while Eleanor pretended not to laugh at the spectacle. Then, Sophia stepped up to the microphone. Before this foundation built our field, Sophia said, reading from a card she had clearly rewritten herself, we practiced in a gravel parking lot. Sometimes people told us girls should not take up space. Now we take up the whole pitch. The crowd roared with approval. Claire's eyes burned with sudden, hot tears. Sophia looked directly toward her and flashed a bright, genuine smile. Whitmore says no one should be pushed out of a place they earned, Sophia continued, her voice gaining strength. So, we are staying. The applause rose like a tide around them. Claire stood very still, anchored by the weight of the moment. There are times when a public sentence returns to you, changed and strengthened by other people's courage. What she had once said in the depths of her pain had become a banner in this girl's hands. It no longer belonged only to the woman who had once stood in a royal box. It belonged to anyone who had ever been told to move, to shrink, to soften, or to disappear. After the ribbon was cut, the girls insisted that Claire take the opening penalty kick. This is a truly terrible idea, Eleanor said, arms crossed. I agree completely, Julian added. Do it, Claire decided. She placed the ball on the spot. The goalkeeper was 9 years old and looked viciously determined to block it. Claire took 3 steps back, laughing at the absurdity of it all. She kicked the ball. It rolled slowly toward the left corner of the net. The goalkeeper dove the wrong way with a display of heroic, unnecessary drama that delighted the crowd. Goal! The children screamed as if she had just won the World Cup final. Claire lifted both arms, happily accepting the wildly undeserved glory of the moment. That night, after the event had wound down, she sat alone in the Estimsti stands while the staff packed away banners below. Her phone buzzed with a message from Thomas Reed. I saw the ceremony, he wrote. Your father would have loved it. Claire smiled and typed back. He would have criticized my terrible penalty technique. Thomas replied, also true. She put the phone away and watched the field lights glow against the dark, quiet sky. Adrienne existed somewhere far beyond the edges of her current, steady life. Cross Global had somehow survived under new leadership. He had stepped back, consulted quietly from the shadows, and avoided the usual public reinvention tours, perhaps because no one would fund them, or perhaps because he had finally learned something. Bianca had given one solitary interview months earlier, admitting she had participated in harming another woman because being chosen by him felt like power. It had not saved her reputation, but it had sounded closer to the truth than anything she had ever whispered in the royal box. Claire wished them both accountability, not total ruin or hollow triumph, just simple accountability. She wished herself peace. That was harder to find, but she was learning how to build it. Chapter 14. The final legal document connected to Adrienne arrived in the autumn. It was a formal confirmation that the sapphire pendant had been removed from all insurance dispute files, restored fully to Claire's personal inventory, and permanently excluded from any marital claim. Eleanor sent it over with a note. The jewel is legally yours again, as if the law had anything to do with it. Claire printed the confirmation and placed it in the wall safe. Then she took out the pendant. The sapphire was deep blue, turning almost black at the center and bright at the edges when she turned it toward the light. Her mother had loved it precisely because it changed with the weather. In the harsh sunlight, it looked royal. In the dim, flickering candlelight, it looked secretive and ancient. Against Bianca's bright suit, It had looked like common theft. Claire carried the piece downstairs to the piano. Her mother had played with enthusiasm, if not exactly skill. Arthur used to sit nearby, pretending to read a newspaper while listening with the devoted, long-suffering patience of a man who loved both the music and the woman who was currently destroying it. Claire remembered lying under the grand piano as a child, feeling the vibrations of the notes travel through the hardwood floorboards and into her very bones. She fastened the sapphire pendant around her neck. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, she finally breathed. The jewel did not belong to the night it was stolen. It did not belong to Bianca's throat, Adrian's clutching hand, or the sterile, plastic evidence pouch. It belonged to every memory she held before them, and every day she would live after them. Claire had almost let the violation become its definition. She would not. Julian arrived for dinner and stopped dead in the doorway when he saw the pendant resting against her skin. "Mom, that is the sapphire," he said softly. "Is it too soon?" "No," she replied, her voice worsening. "It is just right." They ate in the kitchen because both Whitmore siblings preferred kitchens whenever there were no donors present to impress. Eleanor arrived late, winded from the traffic, and immediately diving into a heap of pasta, eating twice as much as she initially claimed she wanted. The talk flowed effortlessly from foundation budgets to the latest football transfers, then veered into the absurd question of whether Julian's dog had actually stolen a roast chicken or been framed by flimsy evidence. Watching them, Claire realized that ordinary life was not less valuable because it followed a spectacle. It was actually more precious because spectacle tries to trick us into believing that only dramatic moments matter. After dinner, Julian turned to her and asked if she ever missed him. Claire looked down into her glass, the reflection distorted. The honest truth was not elegant. "I sometimes miss who I thought he was," she admitted, voice steady. "I miss who I was when I believed it." Julian nodded slowly. Eleanor, dropping her usual sharp demeanor, murmured that such a feeling was perfectly allowed. "I know. Do you?" Claire offered a faint, sad smile. "I am learning." Later, after they departed, Claire stood alone by the window overlooking the quiet, dark street. The sapphire pendant rested cool and heavy against her skin. She found herself thinking about seats and exactly who was expected to give them up. In boardrooms, in marriages, in families, in stadiums, in the dry pages of histories. How often are women praised for their grace when grace is just a synonym for relocation? How often is peace just silence renamed by the person benefiting from it? She had been silent for so many reasons. Love, strategy, habit, a fear of becoming harsh, and the terror of proving his accusations true. But silence was never just one thing. It could be dignity, or avoidance, or patience, or absolute surrender. The vital difference always lay in whether she still possessed the choice. During that World Cup final, Adrian had tried to twist her silence into a form of permission. She had answered him, not with shouting or a scene designed for strangers, but with a direct call to the people who actually knew whose seat it really was. That was the core lesson she kept. When someone attempts to erase you from a place you rightfully earned, you do not always have to scream. Sometimes you only need to state your name clearly and let the records arrive. Chapter 15. 2 years later, Claire sat in a different royal box, with a child on each side of her, mud on her shoes. This match was not a World Cup final, but the atmosphere felt even more significant to her now. This was the championship game for the Whitmore Girls Academy League, hosted in a renovated city stadium with imperfect paint but perfect energy. Sophia captained one side, while Milo's younger sister played on the other. The children beside Claire were Academy Scholarship recipients, and they had asked roughly 400 questions about the stadium lights, the player tunnels, and whether famous people actually ate normal crisps. "Do billionaires even eat crisps?" one asked. Julian, seated just behind them, leaned forward. "My sister eats them secretly and denies it." Claire did not turn. "My brother lies when he is bored," she added. The children giggled. Across the stadium, banners displayed the foundation motto that had emerged from that painful night, a sentiment that had grown far beyond it. No one leaves their earned seat. Claire had resisted using the line at first. It felt too personal, too tethered to the sting of public humiliation. But then coaches began repeating it. Girls painted it on their practice signs. Donors used it without ever knowing the full story. Eventually, Claire understood that slogans, much like grief, could eventually change owners. The whistle blew. The girls played with a ferocious, beautiful joy. They slid, shouted, missed, recovered, argued with the referee, hugged after fouls, and ran as if space itself were a promise finally kept. Claire watched Sophia intercept a pass and drive forward. She was not the most naturally gifted player on the field, but she read the game beautifully, a quiet strength she clearly possessed. She knew exactly when to wait and when to strike. Claire deeply admired that in midfielders and in women. At halftime, Thomas Reed joined her in the box. "Royal Box A12 has a plaque now," he mentioned. Claire groaned. "Please tell me you are joking. Just a small one." "Very tasteful," Thomas promised. "It does not mention the incident. It honors the first foundation announcement." Claire visibly relaxed. "Acceptable." He smiled. Adrian Cross requested tickets last month for a corporate group. Julian immediately leaned in. "Did he now?" Thomas's eyes flicked with amusement. "Standard seats paid in full, no special access requested." Claire considered that. Good. No bitterness rose, and no thrill either. Only information passing through a healed place, leaving her entirely unbothered. That was the moment she knew, fully and without any lingering drama, that she was finally free. The second half began. Sophia's team went down by 1 goal, then managed to equalize in the final minutes. Penalties again. The universe, Claire thought, had a sense of humor and a very limited playbook. Sophia took the last kick. She placed the ball, stepped back and looked directly toward the box. Claire lifted a fist in encouragement. The girl nodded once, then ran forward and struck the ball cleanly. Goal! The stadium, small compared to the World Cup but enormous to every child inside it, erupted. Claire stood with the children, shouting until her throat hurt. Julian lifted one of the kids onto his shoulders. Eleanor, who claimed she disliked noise, applauded so hard her rings flashed in the sun. After the trophy ceremony, Sophia ran to Claire and threw her arms around her. "We stayed," the girl said breathlessly. Claire hugged her back tightly. "Yes, you did that evening, long after the stands had emptied." Claire walked alone along the touchline. The sky was a soft pink above the stadium roof. Her shoes sank slightly into the damp grass. She thought of her father, her mother, Adrian, Bianca, the seat, the necklace. And that night when 90,000 people stood for an anthem while her husband tried to make her disappear. Then she thought of everything that came after. Fields built, girls running, documents signed, lies answered. A ring put away, a sapphire reclaimed, a self rebuilt. Not as a monument to pain, but as a life with doors open in the right direction. She stopped at midfield. For years, Claire had believed that strength meant enduring everything without a single complaint. Then she believed strength meant exposing every wound until no one could deny its existence. Now she understood that strength was larger than both. It was the freedom to choose the right response for the right moment. Silence when silence protected peace. Speech when speech protected the truth. Departure when staying required self-betrayal. Return when the place had always been yours. At the World Cup final, Adrian had thought he was taking a seat from his wife. He had no idea he was actually showing her the exact place where her old life ended and her real, authentic voice finally began. Claire looked up at the empty stands and smiled. No crowd, no cameras, no husband demanding she move. Just a woman standing on grass she helped give to others, knowing at last that she did not have to fight for every seat anymore. Some were hers by record, some were hers by memory, and some, the most important ones, were hers because she had finally stopped abandoning herself. Chapter 16. Adrian's last public attempt to control the story came 6 weeks after the divorce hearing. He chose a Sunday interview with a business journalist, known for giving disgraced executives enough rope to knit their own reputations. The set was tasteful. Gray chairs, a city backdrop, warm lighting, and a small table with 2 glasses of water that no one intended to drink. Adrian wore a navy sweater instead of a suit, signaling humility with the precision of a man who still believed wardrobe could do the moral work. Claire did not plan to watch, but Eleanor certainly did. Julian arrived at Claire's townhouse with takeaway food, claiming coincidence, then immediately connected his laptop to the sitting room screen. Claire stood in the doorway holding a bowl of soup and looked at both of them. "Absolutely not," she said. Eleanor was already arranging documents on the coffee table. "Absolutely yes. I divorced him so I would not have to attend his performances, and I represent you, so performances do not become evidence against you while you are eating soup. Julian lifted a hand. I am here for emotional commentary. You are here because you like conflict. Family conflict, he corrected. It is texture. Claire really should have gone upstairs. Instead, she sat in the armchair and told herself she was only staying because Eleanor was right. On screen, the interviewer began gently. The World Cup final, the royal box, the apology, the divorce. Adrian listened with lowered eyes, nodding in a way clearly meant to suggest that pain had educated him. I made mistakes, he said softly. I have never denied that. Eleanor paused the video. He denied it in writing 12 times. Claire pointed at the screen. Please do not annotate reality every 15 seconds. Eleanor resumed the feed. Adrian continued. What became difficult was that a private marital was amplified by extraordinary wealth and influence. When one spouse has access to institutional power, the other can become voiceless very quickly. Julian sat forward. He cannot be serious. Claire felt no surprise. The line was too polished to be accidental. Adrian was no longer claiming innocence, he was claiming an imbalance. It was clever. It invited the public to pity him as a man crushed by a fortune larger than his own misconduct. The interviewer asked, Are you saying Claire Whitmore used her family's capital to punish you? Adrian looked into the middle distance, calculating the effect. I am saying I wish we had resolved it as two people, not as institutions. Claire set down her bowl. Eleanor was already typing furiously. The interview continued. Adrian praised the foundation. He expressed regret for Bianca's involvement without actually describing it. He said the necklace incident had been a painful misunderstanding over access to family items during a chaotic marriage. He did not say theft. He did not say safe. He did not say he had signed an admission. Then the interviewer asked about Bianca. A sigh. Bianca was young. She was caught in something she did not fully understand. Claire watched his face. There was no tenderness in it, only repositioning. He is feeding her to the room again, she said. Eleanor nodded. Yes. As the interview reached its conclusion, Adrian delivered that final, rehearsed line with a calculated, quiet gravity. I hope one day Claire and I can both admit that pride hurt us as much as betrayal. Julian reached out and killed the screen before Claire could even form a response. For a long, suffocating moment, neither of them spoke. Then a sharp, singular sound broke the air. Claire laughed, though it fell flat against the walls even to her own ears. Pride, she repeated under her breath. Eleanor stepped forward, sliding a crisp, printed document across the table. His written admission confirms he took the pendant from a locked safe without your consent, passed it to Bianca Vale, and then actively pressured you to abandon your seat. I am well aware of what it says, Claire replied. Then we use it, Eleanor countered firmly. Claire turned her gaze toward the window. Outside, the relentless autumn rain blurred the city into gray streaks against the glass. Her mind drifted back to the stadium, those blinding camera lights, the way public empathy had been warped into just another arena for his theater. She was exhausted by the demand to constantly prove her own pain, tired of having to translate clear malicious harm for a public that seemed determined to misunderstand it. No, she finally said, her voice steady. Julian frowned, confused. No, we are not issuing a public statement. Eleanor's expression grew sharp. Claire, he's baiting you. He wants you back in the frame with him. He is desperate for another exchange, another cycle of headlines, another opportunity to paint us as two equally proud people who simply hurt one another. Claire picked up the admission document. We will send this quietly to the journalist and the board at Cross Global because the truth matters. But I am finished climbing into his interview to help him keep this debate alive. Eleanor studied her for a long, silent moment before giving a decisive nod. That is disciplined, she noted. It is also incredibly annoying, Julian muttered, crossing his arms. I had 3 excellent insults ready for the press release. Save them for your memoir, Eleanor replied. By midnight, the journalist received the written admission. The article was quietly updated the next morning with a simple correction. Mr. Cross's characterization of the necklace as a misunderstanding is inconsistent with a written acknowledgement now reviewed by this publication. There was no dramatic quote from Claire, no tearful rebuttal, no new photograph, just the record itself, arriving without his permission. The update spread faster than the original clip. Adrian's PR firm fell silent. The board at Cross Global immediately demanded a new compliance certification within 48 hours. Bianca's own attorney released a single damning sentence, confirming her client would not endorse Mr. Cross's revised version of events. Claire finished reading the updates over breakfast and clicked the tablet shut. Julian looked genuinely disappointed. "That was clinical efficiency," he said. "Were you hoping for fireworks? A small controlled fire would have been nice," she replied. Eleanor just buttered her toast. "Records are far more effective," she said. "Fire just damages the furniture." Claire smiled, a genuine flicker of peace. It was the first day she realized her silence felt different now. It was no longer the silence of a wife swallowing humiliation to protect a man. It was the silence of a woman who had placed the truth where it belonged and refused to perform for the crowd. Adrian tried to drag her back onto the field. This time, she stayed in the stands. Bianca Vale gave her own interview during the deep chill of winter. It lacked the usual glamour, no zazzine covers, no soft-focus redemption arcs, no sensational headlines about the other woman finally spilling secrets. Instead, she chose a serious podcast hosted by a former sports agent, someone known for cutting through the noise of power, image, and the heavy price of proximity to famous men. Claire heard about the broadcast from Eleanor, who had listened at double speed before calling with that specific tone she reserved for matters that were both legally significant and deeply irritating. "You should hear a portion of this," Eleanor advised. "Must I?" Claire asked. "No, but there is one specific section that belongs to you," Eleanor insisted. Claire listened that evening, sitting in her office with the lights dimmed, the sapphire pendant resting against her sweater. Without the roar of the stadium as a backdrop, Bianca's voice sounded entirely different. It was less airy, less ornamental, still cautious, but stripped of the sugarcoating she had once worn like armor. The host asked, "When did you realize Claire was not the woman Adrian had described?" Bianca took a long, shuddering breath. "When she told me to leave the necklace," she replied. "Not because she sounded angry. She didn't. That was the most devastating part. She sounded like someone who had finally stopped being surprised." Claire looked down at her hands, the weight of the memory pressing in. Bianca continued, "Adrian told me his marriage was dead. He said Claire was cold, controlling, more loyal to her family's money than to him. He claimed she used him socially while offering him no respect at all. I wanted to believe him because it made me feel less like the other woman and more like the one who actually understood him." The host did not rescue her from that admission, which Claire found strangely validating. "But I also knew things were wrong," Bianca confessed. "I knew the seat mattered because he was obsessed with it. I knew the necklace mattered because he smiled when he told me it had been hers. That smile should have been a warning. Instead, it made me feel chosen." The word chosen landed with a heavy sense of shame. The host pressed further, asking, "Do you see yourself as a victim of Adrian?" Bianca paused. "Sometimes of my own vanity, yes, but not of Claire. I hurt her. I participated in her humiliation. I wore something that belonged to her dead mother, simply because I liked the feeling of having replaced her." "There is no elegant version of that truth," Bianca said. Claire paused the audio, the silence of the room feeling suddenly very heavy. For over a year, the public had labeled Bianca with every insult imaginable: home wrecker, opportunist, foolish girl, gold digger, victim, liar. Claire had always resisted those simplistic, single-word summaries. They were far too convenient. Bianca had been cruel. Bianca had been used. Bianca had known the truth. Bianca had been fed lies. These realities didn't cancel each other out. They sat together in an uncomfortable, tangled heap, as most human truths do. Claire pressed play again. The host asked, "Have you apologized to Claire?" "Yes," Bianca said. "Badly at first, better later through counsel. I do not expect forgiveness. Expecting it is just another way of taking from someone." That statement made Claire lean back in her chair. The interview shifted toward the strange, hollow economy of being visible for the worst thing one has ever done. Bianca spoke candidly about leaving the world of luxury influencers behind, taking a junior role at a communications firm, and learning how to write actual briefs instead of shallow captions. She did not present herself as a woman reborn or transformed. She sounded like someone still meticulously cleaning a room she had helped wreck. At the very end, this host asked what she would say to other young women who believed that being chosen by a powerful man meant they had somehow won. Bianca was silent for a long time. "Ask what he needs you to help him destroy," she finally said. "If the answer is another woman's dignity, you are not being chosen," she continued. "You are being recruited." Claire stopped the audio right there. She did not cry. She did not feel instantly healed by Bianca's self-awareness, but something old and sour that had been lodged in her chest finally began to loosen. The next morning, the interview became a headline. Some praised her accountability, while others dismissed the whole thing as a desperate play for reputation repair. Adrian's loyal supporters claimed she was merely bitter. Football fans turned that final, cutting line into thousands of viral posts. Claire said nothing to the press. Privately, however, she wrote Bianca a brief note. It wasn't warm, it wasn't intimate, and it certainly wasn't absolution. It simply said, "I heard the interview. Thank you for telling the truth without asking me to carry it for you." Bianca replied 3 days later. "I am learning how not to make other women pay for my own hunger," she wrote. Claire tucked the note into a separate folder, away from the legal files. It wasn't in the memory box, and it wasn't in the trash. It was somewhere in that middle space where unfinished human things belonged. The following spring, the Whitmore Legacy Gala returned to London. Claire had almost cancelled the entire event. The previous year had turned her private grief into public symbolism. And the prospect of standing beneath those chandeliers, while donors applauded her resilience, made her want to retreat into the foundation office with her spreadsheets. But the gala funded 37 pitches, 8 coaching scholarships, and a girls' referee program that Eleanor insisted was the best use of money, arguing that teaching teenagers to enforce the rules is the foundation of civilization. So, Claire went. The ballroom was packed with athletes, coaches, donors, and children from the academy programs. There weren't many celebrities this time. Claire had learned that while fame could help a cause, it could also devour it if not watched carefully. The tables were decorated with small brass lamps instead of towering, opulent flowers so that people could actually see and talk to one another. Her father's photograph stood near the entrance, accompanied by a muddy, well-worn football rather than a marble bust. Julian walked her in. "No husband," he noted dryly. "No mistress, no stolen jewelry. It is already a much better event." A low bar cleared with genuine elegance. Claire wore black velvet and her mother's sapphire pendant. This time, when the cameras flashed, she did not flinch. It belonged against her skin, not as evidence or property, but as a memory restored to the light. Halfway through the dinner, the foundation played a short film highlighting the new pitches. It showed children shouting under the glare of floodlights, coaches frantically drawing tactics in chalk, and a goalkeeper diving into the mud with total, uninhibited commitment. Sophia appeared at the very end, looking older and taller, speaking directly into the camera. "A field is not just grass," she said. "It is proof that someone expected us to show up." The ballroom erupted in applause. Claire looked down at her program, focusing on the text until the lump in her throat finally eased. Then came the auction, a signed ball, a training session with a retired champion, a naming gift for a new league. Donations climbed rapidly. The mood warmed into a genuine, collective generosity, the kind that made rich people feel good and, when managed with purpose, actually made useful things happen. The gala reached its peak when the host announced an anonymous matching gift of $20 million for the Girls Access Initiative, sending a literal ripple of electricity through the ballroom. Claire froze. She certainly had not authorized any such matching donation. She shot a sharp look toward Eleanor, who seemed just as blindsided and deeply displeased by this pre-Cespi's act of philanthropy. The host continued, oblivious, reading the note attached to the pledge aloud, in honor of the seat that should never have been questioned. A sudden, tense murmur swept across the room. Julian leaned in close, his voice a low, jagged rasp, telling her to confirm it was not him. Eleanor was already frantic on her phone, her expression shifting from irritation to alarm. "It is cross-global," she whispered, confirming a board-approved corporate gift. Not Adrian personally. Claire sat perfectly still, processing the weight of it all. Cross Global had somehow survived and rebuilt under entirely new leadership. Grant Mercer had taken over as the permanent chief executive officer. Throughout the last year, The company had been aggressively repairing its governance, paying off massive legal penalties, and funneling money into transparent community projects as a way to restore their damaged sports business. Technically, Adrian had no executive authority to authorize such a gift. Still, that single, pointed sentence in the note referenced the seat, her seat, and the stinging humiliation she had endured. The host, completely unaware of the complex emotional storm raging at table 1, continued to smile brightly. Before anyone could try to improvise or intervene, Claire stood up. Every head in the room turned toward her. She made her way to the microphone, the sapphire pendant at her throat, cool against her skin. Eleanor watched her with the strained, hyper-focused look of a lawyer desperately trying to pull a client toward brevity. "Thank you," Claire said, her voice steady. "The Foundation accepts Cross Global's gift under the same rules as every major partnership. Transparency, accountability, and measurable access for children who need athletic fields, far more than institutions need empty applause." A few people in the back laughed softly at the blunt assessment. Claire didn't break her rhythm. "As for the note, I will say this once. That seat became a public symbol because someone tried to turn an earned place into negotiable space. But the work was never about one single chair in one stadium. It is about building enough fields, classrooms, boardrooms, and futures that no one ever has to beg to remain where they belong." The applause began as a tentative ripple before swelling to fill the entire ballroom. Claire did not look triumphant or victorious. She looked, as Eleanor noted later, both unbearable and entirely correct. Once the gala officially ended, Grant Mercer made his way toward her near the exit, his posture stiff with clear apprehension. He looked genuinely nervous, which Claire decided was a healthy reaction for a man in his position. "The note was my mistake," he admitted quickly. "I meant it to be respectful, but I can see now that I placed personal history where the focus should have been on the program itself." Claire studied him, watching the way his face tightened when she didn't offer immediate forgiveness. "Yes," he finally winced, clearly catching her silent critique. "I understand. The gift will build fields, every cent restricted by our public reporting requirements. Only then do we accept." Grant nodded, taking the condition in stride. "For what it is worth, Adrian had no part in it," he added. "I know," she replied. "He asked me to tell you that he is glad the company is doing this." Claire glanced across the ballroom, where a group of children were sneaking leftover desserts while pretending not to notice her. "Tell him the work matters more than the message," she said. Grant offered a faint, tired smile. "That sounds exactly like you." "It sounds like my father," she corrected him. "Then I will quote neither of you and simply say thank you for the contribution." That night, after the guests had finally departed and the ballroom stood empty, Claire remained beneath the dimming chandeliers with Eleanor and Julian. "20 million pounds, Julian remarked, shaking his head. "All for a seat." Claire shook her head slowly. "No, for fields." Eleanor looked satisfied, her posture relaxing. A good correction indeed. Claire touched the sapphire at her neck. The old ache was still there, a ghost of a feeling. But it was no longer sharp or all-consuming. A year ago, the mere mention of that seat would have reopened every wound. Tonight, it had finally become just context, not a command. She looked around at the cleared tables and the exhausted staff. "I think I am done being the woman from the royal box," she said. Julian's face softened into a smile. "Who are you now, then?" Claire offered a small, genuine smile of her own, the woman funding the next match. Eleanor lifted her glass of water in a toast. A much better title, she agreed. And it was. Subscribe for more stories about quiet strength, the burden of hidden power, and the inevitable moment where betrayal finally meets its consequence.